There is a filing system inside the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of Natural History that contains accession records going back to 1846. Every object the Smithsonian has ever received, catalogued, transferred, or disposed of is supposed to be in those records. Researchers have been requesting specific entries from the 1890s for decades. Some requests come back fulfilled, others come back with the same answer. No record found. This is a story about one of those missing records. In the spring of 1897, a farmer named James Winchell was breaking ground on his property outside Bealsville, Ohio. What he encountered approximately 4 feet below the surface stopped his plow. He had hit something solid. He dug around it. Then he kept digging. What emerged from the soil of Bealville that spring was a human skeleton measuring by multiple witness accounts recorded in the Belpre Farmer's Bulletin that April approximately 8 feet in length. Winchell was not a curious man by most accounts. He was a working farmer in a working county. He covered the find, walked to town, and told the editor of the local paper. The editor came, a doctor came, a county official came. The skeleton was measured, examined, and reported in front of witnesses. The bulletin ran the story on April 9, 1897. 2 representatives from the Smithsonian Institution arrived the following day. They stayed 3 days. When they left, they took the skeleton with them. Nobody in Bealsville ever heard from the Smithsonian again. That would be a strange story on its own. A single anomalous find, a single institution's response, a single silence, unexplained, but not necessarily inexplicable. Artifacts get collected, records get lost, history moves on. But Bealsville was not a single incident. It was a data point inside a pattern that stretches across 4 decades of American history and touches something that nobody in the official record has ever fully explained. The Smithsonian Institution was founded in 1846 with funds bequeathed by James Smithson, a British chemist who had never set foot in America. The terms of his will were straightforward. The money was to be used for the increase and diffusion of knowledge. Congress spent 11 years arguing about what that meant before establishing the institution in Washington. By the 1880s, it had become the dominant archaeological authority in the United States. If something significant was dug out of American soil, the Smithsonian expected to know about it. What it did with that knowledge is the question. Between 1860 and 1900, American newspapers reported over 1,000 discoveries of unusually large human skeletal remains. This is not a fringe claim. It is a documented archival fact. The New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, Scientific American, the Worthington Advance, the Wisconsin Decca Republican, dozens of regional papers across Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin, West Virginia, and Tennessee published accounts of excavations that produce skeletal remains described consistently as between 7 and 9 feet in length, and in several cases larger. The finds shared recurring details, skulls with pronounced brow ridges, and in multiple accounts, a double row of teeth, burial mounds consistent with the Adena and Hopewell cultures that predated European contact by centuries, copper artifacts, and ceremonial objects found alongside the remains. In several cases, the bones were reported to have crumbled or turned to powder upon exposure to air, making the immediate contemporaneous accounts the only surviving documentation. The geography of the reports follows the geography of the mound systems. The greatest concentrations appear in the Ohio River Valley in the upper Mississippi corridor along the shores of the Great Lakes. These were also not coincidentally the territories being surveyed, partitioned, and sold most aggressively during the same decades. The land offices in Cincinnati and Chicago and Milwaukee were processing homestead applications by the thousands while the county papers were reporting finds in the same fields being broken for the first time. And in case after case, the Smithsonian sent representatives, collected the materials, issued polite acknowledgments to local newspapers, and then went quiet. The journalist of the Worthington Advance wrote in 1891, "And I am working here from a microfilm transcription held at the Ohio History Connection that the gentleman from Washington had assured the town council that the discovery would be fully reported and the remains preserved for scientific study." 7 years later, the paper's successor publication asked the Smithsonian what would become of the Worthington find. The Smithsonian replied that it had no record of receiving any such materials from Worthington, Ohio. No record of receiving them. Not lost, not transferred, not destroyed in a fire or a flood. Simply no record that they ever arrived. This is the detail that started pulling at me. Not the skeletons themselves, not the question of what they were or what their existence would mean, but the institutional response, the pattern of arrival and silence, the records that were never filed or were filed and then lost, and the specific timing of when this pattern begins and when it ends. The Smithsonian's Bureau of American Ethnology was formally established in 1879. Its first director was John Wesley Powell, the geologist and explorer best known for leading the first government survey of the Grand Canyon. Powell was a rigorous scientist and a formidable administrator. He was also operating inside a specific intellectual and economic context that is impossible to understand the period without confronting directly. The 1870s and 1880s were the decades when the land question in America was being settled in every sense of that word. The Homestead Act of 1862 had opened the continent to individual settlement. The railroad companies were receiving federal land grants of extraordinary scale, hundreds of millions of acres, in exchange for laying tracks westward. The federal government was completing its negotiations with native nations through the reservation system, finalizing through treaty and through force what the legal ownership of the American interior would look like going forward. And undergirding all of it was a foundational argument repeated in congressional debates, in legal briefs, in newspaper editorials, and in the scholarly literature of the era that the land being distributed, sold, homesteaded, and capitalized was either empty or had been occupied by peoples without a competing claim to prior civilization, sophisticated enough to constitute prior ownership in any legally relevant sense. If the burial mounds of Ohio and Indiana and Wisconsin contained the remains of a civilization that was large, architecturally accomplished, and old in ways that complicated that argument, the consequences were not merely scientific. They were legal. They were financial. They were embedded in the title chains of millions of acres of land that had already been sold, mortgaged, granted to railroads, and leveraged as collateral by the largest capital interests in the country. The Central Pacific and Union Pacific alone received over 44 million acres in federal land grants between 1862 and 1871. The Northern Pacific received nearly 40 million more. The Illinois Central, the Burlington, the Santa Fe, the Southern Pacific. By 1880, the railroad companies collectively held more American land than any other private interest in the country. And they were selling it, parceling it, advertising it in Europe, moving immigrant settlers onto it by the hundreds of thousands. The capital markets in London and New York had priced that land into bond offerings that financed the entire expansion. Every acre had a title. Every title rested on a history in which no prior civilization had organized claims that could complicate the chain. Not an unsolvable one, but a problem that required confronting at a moment when the machinery of distribution was already in motion. When the railroad bonds had already been issued, when the land grant colleges had already been funded, when the capital had already been deployed on the assumption that the historical ledger was clean. The mound builder question had circulated in American popular culture since the late 1700s. The earthworks scattered across the Ohio and Mississippi valleys. Enormous geometric enclosures, conical mounds rising 30 and 40 feet from the surrounding plain, were clearly the product of organized and sustained labor. Thomas Jefferson excavated a burial mound in Virginia in 1784, the first scientific archaeological excavation conducted in North America, and recorded the skeletal remains with care in his notes. His conclusion was cautious. He did not know who had built the mounds. He did not pretend to. By the 1880s, the Smithsonian had a more confident answer. Powell's Bureau of American Ethnology published its definitive report on the moundbuilders in 1894. After a decade of systematic surveys, the conclusion was that the mounds had been built by the ancestors of contemporary native peoples, not by a separate and vanished race. As a scientific matter, this conclusion was almost certainly correct. The archaeological consensus has held it for over a century. But the timing of the report and the thoroughness with which it dismissed competing physical evidence have been a source of friction ever since. Because the 1894 report coincided almost precisely with the period in which newspaper accounts of anomalous skeletal finds began to disappear from the American press. Before 1894, hundreds of reports spread across decades of regional and national coverage. After 1900, almost none. The transition happens too cleanly to be entirely coincidental. Consider what was at stake in economic terms. The distribution of federal land after the Civil War was not administered through a neutral process. It ran through legal frameworks that depended on specific historical claims about who had been where and what they had built. Clean title required a clean history. A history in which the land's prior occupants had left no structures, no evidence of organized civilization, no monuments that might anchor a competing legal interest. The 1894 report resolved the mound builder question in a way that was legally and economically convenient for the land distribution system already in operation. Whether Powell and his colleagues understood this consciously or whether the institutional pressures of the era shaped the science without anyone directing it explicitly is a question I cannot answer from the available record. What I can say is that Powell operated inside a government structure whose primary interest in the American land question was finality. And finality required no anomalous civilizations. No anomalous civilizations meant no anomalous skeletons. And so the Smithsonian representatives came quickly and took what they found. And the records did not follow. James Winchell died in 1914. His farm was absorbed into a larger agricultural operation sometime in the 1920s. The field where he found the skeleton has been plowed hundreds of times since. Whatever else was in that ground was either removed in 1897 or scattered by a century of cultivation. His grandson, according to a letter held at the Belmont County Historical Society and dated 1963, remembered being told the story as a child. The old man described it the same way every time. The 8 feet of it, the copper bracelet on the wrist, the way the jawbone was shaped different from anything he had seen in his life. And then the men from Washington came and it was like it never happened, like the ground gave something back and then the proof went with it. That is one family's memory. It is not scientific evidence of anything except that the story was told, kept, and eventually written down. But it sits alongside the newspaper accounts, the missing accession records, the 1894 report, and the economic structure of the period in a way that resists easy filing. The Smithsonian has never, to my knowledge, issued a comprehensive accounting of what it received from mound excavations between 1880 and 1910, what became of those materials, and why so many excess ion records from that window are absent or incomplete. Freedom of information requests have produced partial responses. Others have been told the records requested do not exist. The newspaper archives say one thing. The institutional records say another. The family memories say a third. And in the storage facilities of the National Museum of Natural History, in the cataloged collections and the uncatalogued holdings and the pending review materials that public researchers cannot access. The question is sitting the way it has been sitting for over 100 years. The land that Winchell farmed is still farmland. The title to it passed through the standard chain of American property law without interruption. The capital that was deployed against the land grants, the railroad bonds, the homestead mortgages of the 1880s and 1890s compounded forward through a century of transactions into the modern American economy. The historical foundation those transactions rested on was settled definitively by a government bureau in 1894. There is a reason the Smithsonian moved quickly. There is a reason it sent representatives within 24 hours to a farm in a county most of its administrators could not have found on a map without help. Speed is not the behavior of an institution with casual interest. Speed is the behavior of an institution that already knows what it is looking for and already knows what it needs to do with what it finds. The machinery was in place before Winchell ever hit bone with his plow. The Bealsville visit in 1897 was not improvised. It was procedural. The farmer found something in the spring of 1897. The Smithsonian came the next day. What they carried out of Bealsville does not appear in any accession record that researchers have been able to locate. And the legal and economic framework that made the disappearance convenient was not accidental. It was the operating logic of the era written into land grants and bond prospectuses and government bureau mandates and finally into a scientific report issued in 1894 that closed the question before most Americans knew the question had been open. That is where the evidence stands. Not at a conclusion, at a shape. A shape that looks less like coincidence the longer you examine it and more like the outline of something that was arranged rather than merely allowed to happen. The newspapers still exist. The microfilm is in the county libraries. The accession request procedures are still available to any researcher with the patience and the institutional access to use them. The letter is still in Belmont County. There is almost certainly more in those county archives, in the historical society boxes that have not been fully cataloged, in the church records and the probate files and the land surveyor notes from the 1890s that nobody has systematically searched against the newspaper accounts. The record is incomplete. But incomplete is not the same as gone. And the shape of what is missing tells you almost as much as the shape of what remains.